I'm Adam from WhatCulture.com, and this is the Pipebomb. The WWE Hall of Fame is a veritable who's who of wrestling royalty. Megastar draws, grappling founding fathers, and also Drew Carey is in there. There are a few notable omissions from the hall that for fans persistently chip away at the institution's legitimacy. The fact that Snoop Dogg is in it, but Andy Kaufman isn't. Bruiser Brody's not in there. Rick Rude, Dynamite Kid, Owen Hart. But one of the biggest snubs is a guy that you probably haven't heard of, one of the most influential pioneers of the wrestling business, a guy that mapped out a whole new wrestling style, the echoes of which we recognise in a squared circle to this day. He's one of the founding fathers of what we know pro wrestling to be, and it's damn near certain that WWE as we know it would not exist without him. That man is Joe Toots Mondt. The purpose of this episode of the Pipebomb is very simple. Get Toots Mondt in the 2017 WWE Hall of Fame class, because as you're about to hear, he deserves the living out of it. Toots Mondt was born James Irvin Mondt in Garden Grove, Iowa, before growing up farm boy strong, and there ain't no strong like farm boy strong, in Colorado before making his wrestling debut in 1912. Wrestling at the time was a very different animal, like a platypus, I have no idea what I'm saying. The carnival wrestling scene was still strong. Remember, professional wrestling as a crowd sport evolved out of the circus industry. Strong men developing cults of personality and feats of genuine amateur wrestling skill against paying customers and each other. When the sport evolved to the point that independent shows were being built around matches between these famous traveling grapplers, again the matches looked and felt completely different. The exhibition matches made famous by George Hackenschmidt and Frank Gotch, true giants of the industry, were traditionally lengthy affairs. And by lengthy, I mean traditional Blompier penis lengthy. Matches would average about an hour, often going 2 or 3. Fun fact, the year Mondt debuted, 1912, at the Olympics that year, an amateur wrestling match went the longest in the history of the sport at 11 hours and 40 minutes. Imagine watching the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy extended editions back to back, but instead of all the CGI, it's a Russian dude and a Finnish dude tussling for the entire time. Madness. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the audiences were starting to tire. See, pro fights may have been fixed, but they were still presented as totally legitimate, and a huge part of that was having them be almost shoot fights, which means almost the entire match, the entire hour, often more, would be the competitors mat wrestling, applying and escaping holds on the floor, twisting a bit for 60 pissing minutes. That is bananas, especially to us now in the internet age of instant gratification. But even in the 20s, when nobody smiled and the only thing that didn't occur at a glacial pace was sex, even then fans saw the 60-minute hugathons and thought, enter Toots Mondt. After debuting, Mondt had been picked up and trained by a wrestler called Farmer Burns, who was a superstar in his day, as you'd expect from someone with the pure box office nickname of Farmer. On Burns' recommendation, Mondt associated himself with another superstar of the day, Ed the Strangler Lewis. Now, despite the fact that he looked a bit like a Sontaran, Ed Lewis was a big-time guy, like proper big-time. He was the innovator of the sleeper hold, which led to his nickname. Either that or, all those murders he did. Either or. Ed Lewis also had a manager called Billy Sandow, who would also become an influential figure, so much so that, yes, Damien Sandow took his name from him. In 1922, these three men, frustrated at being hamstrung by capricious promoters and noticing the dwindling popularity of the really long, really intricate wrestling matches, set about booking their own shows with a new approach, new rules, and new movesets that would completely turn the industry upside down. Also, depending on what sources you read, whether online biographies or books like Fall Guys, The Barnums Have Bounced, books that documented the time, Mondt was responsible from anywhere between 60 to 90% of these innovations. First of all, they introduced time limits, so the audience didn't, die of boredom. They also completely overhauled the style of offense that wrestlers could employing moves from Greco-Roman wrestling, boxing, martial arts, other fighting styles. The grapplers weren't allowed to mat wrestle for too long, and they were forced to add flashier moves to their arsenal, like power slams, suplexes, arm drags, bare-knuckle brawling. Now that sounds pedestrian, but to an audience raised on amateur mat wrestling, these moves were about as fresh as a 630 senton. They did other things like popularizing tag team wrestling, another staple of modern grappling. They also introduced a then revolutionary, now fundamental style of booking matches. They built long-term feuds. Now sure, feuds had happened between individual wrestlers organically in the past, but with these new self-imposed rules, they could generate them artificially. Time limits allowed them to book time limit draws, which at the time were incredibly incredibly effective ways of not just ratcheting up tension in a match, but also prolonging feuds while making both competitors look strong. They battled to a draw, now increased the time limit for the next confrontation between the two, and you've got an escalating story and an instant sell. They were sort of the first proper promotion, as they contracted wrestlers for long periods of time to be part of a roster in order to build long-term storylines, and that wasn't common at all. Within this promotion, Toots Mondt became widely known as being the master of the finish. Again, a new concept at the time. Mondt, who booked nearly all the matches, insisted on choreographing the ending of these matches intricately to generate maximum excitement, always keeping in mind how to ramp up the audience for the next matchup between the wrestlers. Again, this all seems so utterly basic now, but it was genuinely new. The flashier, audience-friendly style was dubbed slam bang western style wrestling, and it led to a huge wrestling boom throughout the early 20s. For a number of years, the team of Ed Lewis, the champ, Billy Sandow, the manager, and Toots Mondt, the booker and enforcer of his promotion's rules, became the three most successful wrestling promoters in America. So much so they picked up the nickname the Gold Dust Trio, which isn't to say that all three men went around covered in gold paint with ball gags in their mouth. I mean, there's no evidence to say they didn't, but anyway, considering that these changes are still the absolute bedrock of pro wrestling, this should be enough to guarantee Mondt's place in the Hall of Fame, right? Well, shut up, motherfuckers, it doesn't end there. The Gold Dust Trio went their separate ways in the late 20s, but Mondt continued to promote, at one point being part of the infamous Wrestling Trust, a collection of promoters who carved up North America into territories and split the profits, the mafia of wrestling, basically. At the time, wrestling in New York City was pretty much run by one man, Jack Curley. When he died in 1937, Mondt cautiously moved in, promoting cards with a bunch of other guys, including a promoter who chiefly specialised in boxing, a Mr. Jess McMahon. Does that surname mean anything to you? Mondt's promoting rose to new heights in 1949 when he became the first promoter in 11 years to book a wrestling show in a venue that would later become really quite important indeed in the history of wrestling, Madison Square Garden. February 22nd, 1949 saw Mondt and McMahon, through McMahon's connection with infamous boxing promoter and controller of MSG, Tex Rickard, put on the first wrestling match in the Garden in over a decade of it being banished because of its reputation. Gorgeous George versus Ernie Dusek. History buffs will know MSG, of course, as WWE's spiritual home, and Mondt broke a decade-long embargo of wrestling in the venue. The partnership of Mondt and McMahon was officially recognized when they founded the Capital Wrestling Corporation in 1952, and they joined the NWA. Not that one, the National Wrestling Alliance. Then in 1954, Jess McMahon died, although I'm still not entirely convinced that a McMahon can be killed. 2 years after that, Mondt would join forces with Jesse's boy, Vincent J. McMahon. In 1963, Mondt and McMahon Jr. pulled out of the NWA, again not that one, and started the worldwide wrestling federation, the WWWF, with its own world title, and pretty soon it was the only game in town in New York City, due in no small part to the fateful decision to build the company around an Italian-American called Bruno Sammartino. Who pushed for him to be the top guy? That would be Toots Mondt. Vincent J. McMahon saw Sammartino initially as a mid-carder at best. Now, Mondt wasn't perfect. He was edged out of booking in the late 60s because he couldn't grasp this newfangled wrestling on TV malarkey, and he was reduced from head booker to a mere salaried employee in the company. Also, he was heavily into gambling, and the debt left him penniless when he died in 1976, which is why him being inducted is so important. The man has faded from collective memory, and he is, and I am not exaggerating, one of the most important men in the history of professional wrestling. He redefined the style in the 20s, basically creating the DNA of modern Western wrestling. He got wrestling back into Madison Square Garden, and he founded the precursor to WWE, the global industry leader. He also secured the early years of that company's prosperity by helping to make a star out of Bruno Sammartino, whose regular habit of selling out Madison Square Garden, where he got wrestling back into, remember, it made WWF unstoppable. If Vincent Kennedy McMahon is on top of the wrestling world, he only got there by climbing on the shoulders of giants like Mondt. Now, Ed the Strangler Lewis, remember him? He was inducted in 2016 as part of WWE Hall of Fame's new Legacy Wing, designed to honor the founding fathers of the craft. Toots Mondt, the Colorado Cowboy, belongs in this wing, and he deserves his induction sooner rather than later. Hashtag Mondt for Hall of Fame 2017. I'm Adam from WhatCulture.com, and this is the Pipe Bomb.